Alex, I consider myself a member of the Disillusioned Youth of America, as I would call it. I'm a card-carrying participant of that organization. I just feel that the political climate today is just absolutely pathetic. That it's hit rock bottom. That we elect candidates and expect them to go into office to change our lives for the better and to really, affect the day-to-day welfare of their constituents. And yet they go in and what they end up doing, they end up throwing mud across the aisle. They end up spending most of their time working to defame the opposition. I find it pathetic and sickening. So when I look at Bill Richardson, I feel like I'm looking at a candidate who can work with opposition from all sides. He can work with people who oppose him within his own party. He can work with Republicans. He can work with independents. Anyone who may have any inclination to disagree with him. Let's start off within his own party. So even though you might believe that just because two people are Democrats, they would agree and be able to push something through the legislature, that might not always be the case. I mean, your perfect example is Bill Clinton's healthcare plan in the early 90s. He had a democratically controlled Congress, and yet he wasn't able to pass this through. I mean, he refused to make concessions. He had these unilateral talks, and in the end, it failed. And he didn't get anything he wanted. It was a major, major failure, especially because it was one of his major platform planks in the '92 election. And then you look at someone like a Bill Richardson. If you take my favorite story of his, back when he was just elected to the governor's mansion, he instituted a plan to create a railroad system between the major cities in New Mexico. And even though he had democratically controlled the state legislature, it was almost immediately shot down because it was seen to be not economically viable, and that it would help a few but not many, and in the end the state would waste a ton of money. But he makes concessions, he talks with them, he works it through, and eventually it's passed by the state legislature. And then, a few years later, once it's all done and has been working for a couple of years, it is one of the biggest, it draws some of the biggest revenue to the state. I mean, out of all the government ventures, and there are plans for expansion and so on. It is something that he had to do to work with people within his own party to get done, even though they disagreed with him. I think you look at a more general sense, he's very well respected within the political community. I mean, his work as a congressman, as an ambassador, was, lauded. It's very successful. So you never really see Republicans or other Democrats go after him because, in the end, they realize that Richardson's a person who would never do the same. That he is someone who has held true to these ideals, that we should be working together as a nation to really to get things done, rather than, again, slinging mud across the aisles. That it's not worth it at the end. And at the end of the day, their job as politicians, as public servants, is to serve the public. It's not to make sure that that the other party looks bad on a random media segment.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all of that. I wonder though whether there's some times when politicians can get sort of a little carried away with this idea, this notion that, well, everyone is everyone is right in some way. We need to always compromise no matter what, and. Actually, I'm sort of referencing Paul Krugman, who's written a lot about this in reference to some other candidates. He basically says, look, there are sometimes when one policy really is much better than another policy, and if we try to pretend that there's a middle ground on every single issue, you're going to end up with policies that are really not the best, and they're compromises for nothing else but the sake of compromise. And I was wondering how you'd respond to that with regards to Richardson.
I would both agree and disagree. I think that that making concessions and porking up legislation to get your initiatives passed isn't really a good thing. But on the other hand, I don't think any one legislation, when it hits Congress, is necessarily perfect. I don't think any side, Republican, Democrat, anyone in between, necessarily has it all hashed out. That it really is somewhere in the middle. That in the end, you need to work with the other side. Bill Richardson, as president, could have someone introduce legislation for him. He might think it's the best. But someone from the opposition is going to say, well, there are these things that would change. And instead of saying, no, we're not going to change them, this is how it's going to be, he would say, okay, let's work together. Let's see what the best outcome could be. Because if you take a very hardline stance, then in the end you might have something again like what happened to Bill Clinton. Nothing gets done. And in the end, your plan goes to ruin. You need to be able to make concessions. You need to be able to sort of find a middle ground. And while you may think that your plan might be the best, others are, that it's never going to be the case where everybody else agrees with you. So in the end, you really do need to find a common ground where people can unite behind an idea. And that's neither on a fully Republican stance or conservative stance or a fully Democratic or liberal stance. It really is somewhere in the middle.